Now, one of the things that we have noticed is that I'm not sure if this applies to every religion, but I believe that it could possibly apply, which is the theologians, which many of us in the faith traditions we look up to, the theologians, because they are experts. They know the subject matter and they write texts, and future generations follow these texts. Now, the question is, if in the heart of religion, the purpose is to unite people, then people steeped in religious teaching, and even I would say to the perhaps the competence, all right, to even write texts that influence future generation and populations to come. Now, how could there be an even an idea or even a vision that could create what I call as division instead of uniting people? Now, it's a very big question, I guess, could be there in many faith traditions. I think we have seen that even in the recent times, where we have religious leaders who plant the seed of hate, all right, and trying to divide people or even persecute a person or a group of people from another religion. And these come from people who know the religion, or that's how at least people look at them, right? Assuming that they are masters of their religion or leader of a religious group or a community, or even theologians. So the question now is, why do you think this happens? Why is it that perhaps theologians or experts or religious teachers or community leaders, religious community leaders, tend to somehow, instead of bringing people together, they plant the seed of hate or being divisive, and etc. Maybe I'd like to ask Imran, and then maybe Waikit, the both of you would like to perhaps respond.
I think it's a very big question, and it's kind of complex. Why? Basically, what you are asking is that there are theologians or religious scholars who we assume are deeply steeped in their knowledge of the religion, and yet they do not embrace this idea of diversity, or they prefer to go more on a confrontational or even conflictual paths. And that has created lots of problems throughout human history. We acknowledge that, right? Again, I think the issue is not so much about the text, but how the text is being utilized. And not just text, because not all religious traditions are dependent on text, right? But let's talk in terms of the doctrines, or in terms of the religious ideas. We know that the text or even the doctrines or the religious ideas comes in multiple forms, and it has to be interpreted by individuals or groups, and how the interpretation process happens has got to do with multiple layers of factors, including the context of the time. Therefore, we must always look at the context in which a particular understanding of religion prevail. Why, for example, groups that are put in a situation where they're under threat, or they feel that they're under threat, will always see the worldview in a different way from a society that is living in a relatively peaceful situation, and the interpretations will be different. One will be an interpretation that is driven towards seeking justice and to overcome, and looking at it through this lens that there is an enemy and therefore we must unite, we must go against those who are trying to obliterate us, things like that. So those kind of theologies are set in the context of a society that is struggling in that situation, compared to those who are living in a relatively peaceful situation. Their theology will be something different. It will be a theology that says, oh, God is blessing us, that's why we are in a relative peace, and therefore we must maintain this kind of thing. But that also blinds them to the struggles of those who do not appear in public with their multiple forms of sufferings. So the way a person responds to the threat comes from many factors. Number one, I think, is the need to assume power. Power has been a huge problem in many religious societies. And we do know that every religion came with the noble intention of addressing suffering in society. But as the religion gathers more and more people, it becomes a base of power itself. Eventually, many religions develop into empires, And empires are totally human-made, and they are competing for power and resources. And then there's also the factor of the human ego, where you feel that now that you have so much influence, you have every right to determine things for others, and therefore the space for religious freedom becomes more and more constricted. That also creates another layer of problem. So there are many factors why we do not embrace this idea of one humanity, despite you find many resources within the religious traditions advocating for that. And that's got to do with our failures as human beings, and also the natural tendency to gravitate towards power and domination once we assume influence in society. And religion, because it's very deeply embedded, has an identity for many of us, especially in today's context, can be easily abused and can be easily utilized by those who wants to provoke tensions in order to gather more and more power, as well as resources for themselves or for their own group against others. So we must always be on the watch for that, and keep on emphasizing the values within the religious traditions that needs to be surfaced, needs to be promoted, needs to bring us into solidarity across the faith traditions, because every faith traditions have those rich resources that can actually bring us together towards this idea of one humanity, despite our differences.
Everything that you just mentioned, Imran, about power, I mean, just really, really resonated, with what I'm thinking as well about the Buddhist context, because in relation, to Kathy's question about, what is it that, in terms of why do we see this monopolizing of the narrative by, say, a specific theological perspective? And I'm thinking in terms of how Buddhism, for example, right, which is universally well known for pacifism. You think of stereotypical images, right? You have like calming incense, you have everyone just bowing, you have the smiles on Buddha images. There's the image of peace that it has, but I think we need to recognize that no religious tradition holds that monopoly on peace. And in fact, in recent years, there have been all these studies about how there are certain strains, extremist strains, even within the Buddhist tradition. And in the Buddhist context, it wouldn't be so much about theologians, perhaps, but perhaps more about members of the Sangha. Of the monastic community, and there are some members, very few, but there are some members of the Buddhist Sangha who are not as cognizant of the spirit of the Dharma, of the Buddhist teachings, which is why there's that some even go so far as to advocate violence. So it really is based on exactly what Imran was pointing out, these very, very powerful political, economic, cultural forces, especially nationalism, and we've seen that rise in recent years. When these economic and political forces run rampant, they're going to override the peaceful tenets of the faith that, say, traditions like Buddhism would stand for. And you've seen this in very concrete examples, right? You have Buddhist majority Sri Lanka. You have some monks, or I would say, so-called monks, who have been intensely Islamophobic. You have, for example, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingyas, the Muslim minorities in Myanmar. And I mean, it's deplorable. And I think it's an abomination that more of us either don't know about it, or some have chosen to just gloss over some of these news. And I think it's something that more societies need to pay attention to. That even just within a tradition that's well known for peace, you have nationalist ideologues taking advantage of the spiritual authority of certain extremists, and often with the support of very powerful forces like, say, the military. You have that in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in order to bolster that kind of support for a very vicious and xenophobic strain of discourse. So it is, as Imran put it, it's about power, and which is very ironic, because Buddhism should be about the dissolution of the ego. And I do believe we see that many, in fact, I dare say most, if not all, of our religious traditions also focus on how we can, in a way, shift and reframe the narrative such that it's not about the self, it's not about the ego, it's about the other, or it's about putting neighbor before self. Or say to monotheists, it might be about putting God above the self. So I think we really need to understand that there are certain underlying fundamental threats to peace and unity that are not necessarily inherently religious, but it's often about larger forces, and that we have the power to reframe that narrative and to return our to a kind of to the original tenets of peace, yeah, that many of our religious traditions would have been originally based on. Yeah.
Thank you, Waikid and Imran. That's a very candid response. And as I was hearing the both of you talk about this, of course, the word power comes up pretty much, and also the whole idea of straying away from what the religion stands for, which has probably become prevalent, and it has been a problem, I guess, throughout civilizations. I guess in the last more than, I think, 2,000 years, we are seeing this, kings fighting each other and stuff like that. Imran, would you like to share something about that?
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to add on to what I've said earlier about power. Sometimes we assume that it's about the individual assuming that power and abusing that power. But there is one dimension of power that we often forget. It's the power to dictate the narrative. Who has the power to dictate the kind of narrative that we see or we imbibe ourselves knowingly or unknowingly? And I'll give you some example, right? Take, for example, Gandhi. Gandhi has been the paragon of peace and non-violence, but that wasn't the case throughout his life. In the earlier part, he was framed as a troublemaker because he was resisting the British Empire, and he was leading a revolt against the British Empire, albeit in a non-violent way. Another example I can think of is this. Maybe many of us will not have heard of him, but is Emir Abdul Qadir, who is seen as the modern founder of the Algerian state. Now, at one time, he's of course a Sufi saint. Is regarded as a Sufi saint now. He's very steep in Sufi practices, and Sufism is seen as the softer mystical form of Islam that advocates, similar to Buddhism, the turn inwards to cultivate the soul, etc. But he was also a commander of his tribe that were resisting the French invasion of the parts that we know today as Algeria. And he was crafted as a troublemaker, and he was declaring jihad against these opposing forces that were trying to colonize the North African areas, right? But then, of course, he lost and he retreated into Damascus, and he was a totally different person. He, in fact, he was advocating for peaceful coexistence, and he was he was actually responsible for saving more than 2,000 of Christian lives who were at one point being targeted and being massacred by the Ottoman rulers at that time. And now he's hailed as a brilliant example of a peacemaker in today's context. And even there is a school named after him in the in the US. But you see, this is where we need to understand the context of why certain ideas or certain theology or certain ways of understanding religion emerge, which intersects with the socio-political economic context. And therefore, when we talk about whether religion advocates for peace or not, I think religion can advocate for both peace and also for more destructive forces. And we've seen, for example, how in the latter sense, religion being abused in a violent form, in the way of how Al-Qaeda has developed its own theology and promoted global terrorism that targets innocent lives. Now, that is an abuse of power. It's a deviation from the mainstream acknowledged theology of Islam that has always been against the targeting of innocent lives and indiscriminate killing, compared to others who have developed a different theology of peace and yet not pacifist, I would say, because there is also that element of resisting any form of destructive forces, even if it comes from those who are trying to dictate the narrative for us. So I think it's a very complex situation, and we can't really adopt a very essentialist way to understand religion. Religion is a complex phenomenon. It intersects with many other aspects of our realities, and we need to understand that in order to make sense of the world today. And without that, we would never be able to reclaim the rich resources that advocates for peace and peaceful coexistence amidst these diversities. We need to reclaim that by understanding the context in which they have been abused and they've been utilized by those who wants to deviate from this narrative of accepting diversity.
When we are in the religious school, most of the time we're not studying the history as much as we're studying the text. And so perhaps we need actually to study our own religious history. For example, in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition, after Jesus died, the communities of the disciples were small, and they were actually, how shall we say, split up. They went and formed their own community. So they were small, but they were welcoming, and then they welcomed everybody, and they fed them because, you know, and they cared for the poor and the needy and the sick. And you know, whatever there was over a period of time, there were like pandemics, all right? And they were welcoming to these people. And because of their welcoming effort, it grew. And the numbers of these different communities, and they were very diverse, they grew. But what happens is that I think the emperor found that although he was persecuting these Christians, he found that it was a growing force. And so, as you said, Imran and Waikid, he sort of Constantine co-opted the faith. And in the Council of Nicaea, the bishops had to decide which were the different chapters to be included in what you would call the Bible. And later on, Constantine himself would put himself as the representative of God himself. And so then the Roman Empire became the Roman Christian Empire. All right, so you're right. But I think what happens is that most of us, unless we're studying in the arts or history faculty, we don't have an understanding of all these histories. And some of the things that you said, Imran and Waikid, are also new to me. And so this part of this education is missing because we usually focus on the text and we review the text again and again. But for example, I also realized that after the fall of Granada, the King and Queen of Spain, all right, actually authorized Christopher Columbus to go to seek new lands, go to he founded with the West Indies, but they had a papal edict to go with it, that they could claim the land that wherever they found. And so it meant that the natives didn't have any rights at all. And so I think this part of our history also needs to be aware rather than only the glorious parts of the history. And this has led also to, in fact, the blessing of all these explorers, land explorers and land grabbers by the religious leaders, all right? And even when they go to Australia, it was terra nullius, which means it's also an unclaimed land and people can just go and claim the land. And of course, again, the natives were set aside. And I'm actually sorry to say that all of these were under the flag of Christian countries, kingdoms, all right? And so this is the part, I think, in my tradition, we don't reflect upon. We forget. And we also have to remember that even when Sir Stamford Raffles came here to Singapore, all right, we had some, Christian missionaries who were very good, connected with the Malays and the Muslim community. And even I think Benjamin Keysbury was very much loved, that the Sultan gave him a boat to go and travel around the region to go and teach the students, and he taught the Sultan's children as well. But at the same time, a certain kind of lens came together with the colonials, a lens of viewing the indigenous people. And once we don't understand that this lens, we just incorporate it in, and then it comes out in different ways that we do not comprehend or understand, and we don't even realize that we have privileges,
Maybe if I could just add a little before we move on, I'd like to hear what Deva and Nell have to say also. But just really quick before we continue, Guat really, exactly as you said, the importance of learning history. And I just like to add that it's not just about being honest about the sordid past of our own religious traditions, because I think if we dig deep enough, we can definitely find a lot of really the ugly sides, of our own religious traditions as well. But I think it's also about recognizing that there is much to learn precisely because of the in a way these aspects of our own faith traditions that we might not be so proud of, that we can learn from other faith traditions. That's why dialogue and diversity, is so important, right? So I'm just, when you mentioned just now about how Christian missionaries, for example, went around the world. Now there's been a lot about spoken, of course, about how the impact of Christian missionaries in different lands, in Australasia, in the Americas, and so on, as you rightly point out. But how about their good work? Let's think about, they set up schools and hospitals. I mean, that's really impressive. And I'm just thinking about how, Buddhists in Taiwan, for example, and in fact, throughout Asia, they've been so inspired by the good work of a lot of these Christian missionaries that they've also set up Buddhist humanitarian organizations. I'm thinking of Tzu Chi, I'm thinking of Dharma Drum, Fakushan, and so on. Many of the monastics who were behind these traditions were inspired by the practices of the Christian religionists in their midst, because they know, and that's why you have the tradition of engaged Buddhism or humanistic Buddhism. Yeah. So I think there's a lot that we can learn, even in other aspects, gender equality. Why? There's this huge debate in Theravada Buddhism about the role of female monastics, for example, and I think that's something we can definitely learn from other religious traditions. So, and maybe this is an open question to everyone. Also, when you're adding on to respond, I'm thinking of how the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, he once said that it's sometimes more difficult to have a dialogue with people in your own tradition than with those of other traditions, right? Because sometimes it's the people in your own family who misunderstand you, who bicker, and so on. So again, that's why diversity and dialogue are so crucial, because when we understand our own tradition better, we develop that increased respect and that understanding of others as well. Yeah. So yeah, anyone?
Very quickly, I think I really like the points that you've raised, Waikit. I think this is where we can actually, as we dig into our own history, of course, we find both the good and the bad. In fact, I will add that without the contributions of the different religious traditions in interactions and in contact with each other, we will not have human civilization as a whole. Look at the various forms of architecture, of language, of food, of music, of the different civilizational achievements that we have, including the sciences, as a result of the different religious civilizations interacting and embodying and incorporating and assimilating many of these aspects of human achievements. So I think the real problem here is how we understand our own tradition. If we think that we are the best, then we have nothing else to learn. I think here I would propose that we adopt a different mindset and we say to ourselves how we can be better. When we say how we can be better, that means we learn both from the good and the bad from our own history, as well as it opens up to interactions and dialogues across the different religious communities, because all of us wants to be better. And to be better, we acknowledge that there is an ideal, this higher standard that can only be achieved if we come together and critique our own wrongdoings. But at the same time, also we acknowledge that there's much goodness in our faith that needs to be reclaimed and to be repositioned as a focus of our religious life. So it's a value-centric approach to religion, rather than just talking about how we are the best and how we have everything within our own tradition that we have no need to learn from each other anymore.
I would like to add on to Guat's point on educating about the religion, the history. Actually, when she mentioned that, it kind of got me thinking that as a Sikh person, as in a Sikh faith, nobody has actually preached the negative of the religion. Everyone is just saying, do this, you have to meditate, you have to do this, you have to do the prayers, but nobody has actually thought about the hardship, about what negative about the religion. Not saying from other religions commenting that it's a bad religion, but also accepting the negative part of our own religion. That's one thing I'll add. For why, Kiet, for your question, I personally, I'm sharing this. I face this religion communication problem in my household, especially with my mom. I understand what she's saying, and I'm saying the same thing, but she's understanding it differently. Although we are still talking about the same thing, but we have just two communication. There's just two different, vast difference, but the topic is the same. So I think another thing we have to do is, in our household, try and communicate and understand each other. Even if you don't understand, I tend to be, sometimes I get agitated. So, I just, don't ignore, I just ignore the topic, I'll leave it after a few days, and then I calm down and, I try to explain, Mommy, we are talking the same thing. It's just two different approaches that were placed. So I think currently, even through our leaders, they're preaching the same thing. It's not that they're preaching something different, but it's just the way that, and the words, the language that they use is another thing that makes the differences much more visible. And
I totally agree with you. As far as we know all the positive things about our religion, it's very, very important to know where we come from as well. Because then we will not see ourselves as a perfect religion. There's no such thing as perfect religion. There's nothing perfect. We are all human beings. We are going to make mistakes. We are here right now because of all the past mistakes that we have done. Even what Vaikit mentioned, yes, it is very tough because the past generations, they don't have the kind of education or the kind of exposure that we have right now. So somehow, I personally feel that the future lies in our hands. Like this interfaith dialogue, I don't think this would have happened like 20 years back. No, I was part of the interfaith and started 10, 15 years ago. I don't know. But I wouldn't have mentioned that back then because we don't have that exposure. But personally, right now is a good time. It's good to study the illustrious past as well as the Socratic past. And moving forward, we should teach our children about our own religion, our tradition, as well as others as well. We need to get the right information, and I think this is where this interfaith, dialogues and this council will play a big role, in the future to come. Yeah, thank you.
Right, so this is thanks everyone. Great, thanks for sharing what you felt in that present moment. That response was very, very meaningful to me. Listening to all of you, that was fantastic.